Welcome back, everybody, to Environmental Science 101. Here we will cover our third section in the unit on human impacts. So to answer these questions, yes, this is the rainforest in Brazil, and yes, this is a current photo, and yes, this shows a human impact, right? Deforestation, which from the ecological perspective means habitat loss. This can be extremely severe. The sheer rate at which this is going is staggering. So what are the major threats, right? Major human impacts from our side, right? Or major threats from the ecological side? Habitat loss and fragmentation. Fragmentation specifically would be, okay, we have a habitat, right, and we build some sort of highway straight through the middle of it, and now we have two areas which are separate. This by itself is not a major threat, but in combination with habitat loss really is. Overexploitation, right? So overfishing, overgrazing, overexploiting, overusing resources. And if we go back to our social science concept, this idea of the tragedy of the commons, now we can see the other side of it also ties in with our idea of sustainability and what can reasonably be done that makes it so that we can meet our needs without limiting the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Invasive species, right? So invaders, right? And we'll talk in more detail about these species, which has been transplanted to an area where they are not native and wreak havoc. Pollution, right? All sorts, right? So air pollution, water pollution, soil pollution, and climate change. We will do an entire unit on climate change later on, but I have included this just to sort of set our bearings, right? So the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, like the entire Earth's atmosphere, like the entire chemical composition of the entire Earth's atmosphere over time, going back to about 800,000 years, right? So when we talked about fire, that was about 400,000 years ago, just to give us an idea of the scale on this, right? We notice extremely regular cycles, previous high, at least in this time scale, and then our modern average. This is an anomaly that is almost certainly, at this point, beyond any reasonable doubt, caused by human beings. Okay. Reefs and rainforests. So sometimes, especially in other areas, that is not what I'm talking about right now, we have this confusion between examples that are salient and, the real crux of the matter, but in this case, it's really not, right? So reefs and rainforests are extremely salient issues, but they are also places where we have a huge amount of biodiversity loss and a huge amount of biodiversity in the first place, right? So these two, right, the rainforests and the coral reefs, account for something like 90% of all the species that live on the Earth, right? Despite taking up only about 10% of the area. This tends to be an extremely concentrated thing, biodiversity, right? And part of the reason also why I wanted to emphasize deforestation, right? Because this is going to take our rainforest, especially our Amazon rainforest, and lose some of the habitats that are in there. So big impacts in those two areas. Habitat loss in particular is going to be more than anything else the biggest impact that humans have from an ecological perspective, right? On biodiversity, on wildlife abundance, and this is true throughout the entire world, especially the clearing of forests for the purpose of agriculture, right? Or for grazing land. Second greatest impact comes from overuse and overfishing, overexploitation, generally speaking, tends to have the biggest impact on forests we've discussed, and there's also the need for timber, and then wetlands as well, right? Which sometimes there's this idea of, being drained in order to develop the land and use it for other ideas, or just this sense, which sometimes I will hear, that, if the land isn't being used for something by human beings, then it's essentially worthless, right? That it's doing nothing. And as we will see, doing nothing can be very, very smart, right? Ocean acidification, right? One of the results of climate change changes the pH balance of the entire ocean and leads to coral bleaching and death of coral reefs, as we saw many slides ago, going all the way back to the first section. This is associated also with rising temperatures. I wanted to put this in as an example of human impacts and also as an example of taking the wrong conceptual approach to what the environment is and how we as human beings can impact it. So this is the very famous Four Pests campaign. This was part of Mao's Great Leap Forward as part of the Communist Revolution in China, as China went from its pre-modern self to modern self, about 1958 to about 1962. Now, as part of this campaign, the idea was that everybody in the whole country would come together and eradicate these pests of creatures, right? And they identified, right? Rats, flies, mosquitoes, and sparrows, right? And I've included this. So here we have a young man who is doing what he thinks is going to benefit himself and the country by getting a slingshot and shooting it at sparrows. And you do this often enough, and the sparrows will drop dead from exhaustion because they have nowhere to rest. This idea of getting rid of the pests was really effective in terms of getting down the numbers, right? But it turns out that the sparrows were very important because they ate bugs, particularly locusts, which would feed on crops. And so following this campaign of killing as many sparrows as possible, the bugs take over, eat the crops, and you have a famine that lasts years. One of the most horrible things you can imagine. Something like 35 million people die as a result of this misguided environmental policy. And as we will see, this can be avoided entirely by taking the right conceptual approach, just understanding what the ecosystem is and sort of appreciating the unknowns, right? The role of human ignorance in that discussion. Just to give something like a point of reference, New York City has something like 8.5 million people. So this would be 4 New York Cities worth of people who die over a number of years here. It could even be more. It's extremely hard to get an accurate count of something like this. Not good. Comes back to one of our core concepts. If something is really complicated and important and you don't know much about it, maybe err on the side of not messing with it is smart, right? For the sake of your own survival, too. Not its sake, but also its sake. Invasive species, right? Another way that human beings impact ecology and impact our environments and impact biodiversity, typically for the worst, right? And on some level, we can think, okay, well, invasive species from human beings, right? That's introducing new species. Couldn't that really help things? And the answer is almost always no. This is almost always going to be a bad thing. So we can draw this comparison, right? So we have invasive species from elsewhere, they're non-native, and then we have endemic species, right, which are those that exist in the ecosystem in the first place. Invasives come in and take over, right? Moved from a native region to elsewhere where they may or may not have any natural predators, right? Before we get to that part of it, so this is a Burmese python. This is in the state of Florida not too many years ago. This is not native to Florida. These are brought over. They're kept as pets by people who don't pay for the consequences of their own actions, but that's another discussion, right? This one is something like 215 pounds, I believe the news item said. And does this thing have any natural predators in Florida? No. And there's tons of fish, and there's tons of birds, and other stuff for this thing to eat, and they just completely wreak havoc on the natural systems there. And there's no way to undo it, right? No way to put the genie back in the bottle, as they say. This does hit on one of our core social science concepts, right, of the tragedy of the commons, right? Does one individual person pay the cost for something like this? Everybody pays the cost, right? It affects these common goods which are shared by everybody. And so there is a need for collective action, right? In the same sense. There is an incentive for all the people of Florida to come together and act collectively to solve this issue. But no individual person is able to solve it. No individual person has the capacity to solve the issue by themselves. I've included these. These are zebra mussels, which some of us might be familiar with. They are not native to lakes in America, but they generally wreak havoc, right? They are tiny. They reproduce incredibly quickly. They tend to gum up the works, for lack of a better way to phrase it, on boats. Horrible, horrible things. Ask anybody who has a boat in the United States, or especially through the Midwest, and they will tell you these things are awful, horrible invasive species, and there's no undoing it. The damage has been done. But it could be prevented, right? Yes, another example. So there was a fella back in something like 1890, yes, bird keeper in New York, who really loved Shakespeare and thought it would be really poetic if, you know, some of all the birds mentioned in Shakespeare's poems and plays were released into North America. And if the goal was to just have as many of those birds as possible, then he would have done really great, right? So the estimate is that there's something like 200 million European starlings is what he brought over, right? And that's this one here in North America today. In 1890 or before this, you know how many there were? 0, right? Not the best idea, right? This is a bird that outcompetes all the native species. It can dig deeper. It can bully them out of their nests. It eats all of the food that all the native birds need, transmits diseases. It can eat through farmers' crops and fields, right? It's not good. There was a government program to try to get rid of these, especially in the area of New York, in a short time following this, and none of them have been successful, right? And the same is true of skylarks. Very bad human impact can be undone, could be prevented, and could be especially prevented by having some sort of baseline knowledge of the importance of the environment and the way that seemingly small actions can have irreversible giant consequences, right? Yes. We can also, right, so we have human impacts so far in the sense of all these terrible things, and then we can have human impacts in terms of trying to collectively act and solve the problem. We do an entire unit on environmental science and law later on, but I wanted to plug this in as a touch point here because many of us, or even all of us, have heard about endangered species, right? This would have been passed in 1973. It's Nixon era, right? So if we think back to our history of environmental science, this is a time of rapidly growing awareness of environmental issues and impacts. The creation of the EPA, among other legislation that was passed during this time, protects anything. Could be animals, plants, could be fungi. I mean, there's some fungi, especially in other regions, other places in the world, that are delicacies that are considered extremely important and are protected by similar measures. This is a collective action solution to a collective action problem, right? And how does it solve it? It solves it by first making lists of species that are at risk and evaluating them, preparing and implementing plans to benefit them, and then also, very importantly, sort of mechanically, right? Government bodies can only do what they are, explicitly allowed to do, right? They can only do things that they are given the powers to do. They can't just do whatever they want. So this lays out a plan for cooperation with other agencies which have powers that one agency could not have, right? And most importantly, right, we have heard this word endangered, but there are many levels to this, right? So we can have complete extinction, where there's nothing left, right? We can have extinct in the wild is what EW stands for, right? So there might be some sort of captive population or kept in a zoo or research laboratory, but it doesn't exist in the wild. And then we have these different levels of threatened, right? So vulnerable, endangered, and then critically endangered. Finally, we can have areas of least concerned, right? Not threatened or simply okay, right? So it's not just a matter of endangered or not. There's an entire spectrum of ways of evaluating, right, whether something is endangered or not and needs this sort of intervention. Yes. Okay, that wraps up our section here on human impacts. For the next one, we'll talk about biodiversity in Arizona, specifically, like this thing.